This week on Past and Presents, we're on location in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. Brooklyn Park is now the sixth largest city in the state of Minnesota. It's a growing, diverse suburb just north of Minneapolis, but for a long time was a farming community. We're actually at Eidem Homestead, which is a living history farm. It depicts farming life around the turn of the 20th century, and we're going to learn more about this from one of our alums who happens to work for Eidem Homestead. Our host for today's tour of Eidem Homestead is Eve Burlingame, the site coordinator, who also is a 2008 graduate of the Bethel History Department. Eve, just before we start to look around some of the site itself, can you tell us a little bit about how you got this job and what you do here at Eidem?
Well, I first started as a interpreter just out of college, about a year afterwards, trying to get some experience, and it kind of involved where our previous site coordinator had to resign for health reasons, and they asked me if I'd be interested, and it's just kind of evolved from there.
Okay, so what does a typical day in your job look like?
Or
is there no such thing as a typical
there's
day?
no real typical day. It's kind of depends on what we have going on. During the summer, it's very busy. We have programs, and so it's getting ready for the programs. There's marketing aspects, there's research, there's budgeting, there's staffing, lots of different aspects to it.
So it probably keeps you busy and interested.
Very busy.
Well, Eve's going to take us around, but first let's start our conversation for this week, and then we'll come back and see a couple of the buildings here on the site at Eidem Homestead. So a common theme so far in the semester in Intro to History has been the question whether history is actually more of a science or a literature. And of course, the correct answer is both, as usual with all my questions. But to the extent that's a literature, it is a form of writing. And I think we run into a problem, which is I'm not sure Fletcher Warren, Jacob Manning, as students think about history, I'm not sure that good writing comes to mind. And often I think history has a reputation of being very dry and academic. Is that a fair reputation in your experience as students who have read a number of history articles and monographs at this point?
I would say that's a pretty fair assessment, yeah.
That was the wrong answer, but thank you. Explain yourself.
Well, sometimes just the way that sentences are arranged, there's a lot of passive voice that can sneak into some writing. I wouldn't say that's a good, engaging historical writing, but there's a way to do analysis and not make your sentences passive and lead us through a slog of unending descriptions and adjectives.
Well, I think, we should come back to the passive voice because I think that's a really good observation to come back to. Analysis, though, I think is an important term. A distinction I've introduced already to students is Gordon Wood's between narrative history and analytic history. And
Right.
Probably good history does both. It's telling a story, but it's engaging analysis. Why is analysis, I think it does feel cumbersome to students sometimes. What's problematic about that mode of writing that you've encountered it?
Certainly I think you can get bogged down in details is probably the biggest issue. I guess responding to your first question, I think, yes, it's deserved to some extent. The overly specialized monograph has been kind of the whipping boy of historical writing. But at the same time, I'm not sure I like the question so much because, for one, you can sort of historicize the question. Historians have been some of the best writers. I think of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall as a classic piece of English prose. And certainly before that and after.
What do you mean by historicize the writing for students who may be still taking their first history
Sure.
class?
Well, just not accepting the question as a straightforward kind of proposition that doesn't have a past to itself. Considering the question of historical writing and its quality as just reflecting on the discipline right now. I'd like to think about that in broader terms across the era of historical writing.
So a way to combat that is, audiences are bringing their own presuppositions about what good writing is, and those maybe change over time.
Sure.
And the nature of what historians are trying to accomplish might change over time too. So, to me, that's one thing that stands out is if your introduction to history is a History Channel documentary, that is a form of writing, right?
Yeah.
That leads you to expect certain things out of
Right.
it's a compelling story full of characters, and it breezes along pretty quickly. And then all of a sudden you encounter a 300-page monograph that your 300-level professor assigns to you, and it feels like there's a variance.
Sure. But I think there's kind of a functional distinction between these things within the discipline, and it's not so much formalized as it's just sort of evolved that way, where those kinds of narratives, the sweeping narratives that are engaging and interesting to read, I was thinking of actually Stephen Kotkin's new Stalin biography. It's monumental. It's 800 pages, but the sweep of it is fantastic. I mean, he poses it as a history of the world centered around this figure. But that kind of work isn't possible without the slog through those kinds of specialized monographs that everyone hates to read. If you don't have that kind of theoretical backing, you lack accuracy. So while I think that those kinds of overly specialized writing, the highly theoretical types of monographs that people like to tear on so much, are really, they form an essential part of the historical ecosystem, because it's through those that the larger, more interpretive works can actually be written.
Yeah, I think in some ways they're invisible to undergraduates until you're forced to read them. But they are the underpinning of everything else, or the foundation. So Jacob, in your context now, what then describes good historical writing? As you think about a favorite article or book, what are some of the pillars of good historical literature?
Yeah, well, I think analysis is essential. And like you mentioned, Fletcher, that building these interpretive frameworks isn't possible without that really detailed work of picking through the sea of facts and pulling out those that we can use to make sense of the ocean. So that analysis is kind of what the result should be at the end of the day. Is the writing of history should give us some kind of interpretive framework that we can use to understand the past better. If our writing is only descriptive or merely fact-telling, we're not being good historians. So it has to be analytical, and it has to offer some kind of framework for understanding.
Right. I mean, it's not simply an assemblage of primary source evidence that you kind of pastiche together. You've got to step back from and explain why that's where the meaning is. And that's, we've talked often about active interpretation. What distinguishes maybe academic historical writing? I mean, there are other ways of writing about the past, right? You can do that as work of historical fiction. You can write a script to a documentary film. You can write a website of some sort. As you think about books and articles especially, is it the kind of attention to detail, the research that underpins it, the analytical framework? Are there other more literary aspects of it that are distinctive?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a difficult question, because there are a number of professions that do write about the past. I think particularly the distinction between journalism and history is probably one of the most difficult to parse. But in reflecting on that, I think the thing that stands out to me the most is the issue of ambiguity. I think historians are a lot more comfortable with ambiguity, and in fact, the sources often demand coming to ambiguous conclusions. Whereas other professions, it's not to say they don't care about the truth as much, but the journalist's primary objective is to tell a story. The screenplay writer's primary objective is to tell a story. And that doesn't necessarily involve being false, but if you have facts that aren't entirely clear-cut, where there's room for interpretation, I mean, the obvious course of action is to pick the set of facts that tell the story in the way you want to tell it. And I think there's kind of a totalizing element to that, where that ambiguity is sort of shunted aside and not really displayed to the reader. Whereas good historical writing, I think, explores that ambiguity and doesn't allow that to just disappear.
Many people who study history oftentimes don't know much about Latin America. It's like 1/5 of the world's landmass. The largest Hispanic population in the world is there. The largest Catholic population is there. A lot of theology is coming from there. One of the most vibrant parts of the church today is the Hispanic church. We know that a few years ago, Hispanics surpassed every other ethnic group or minority ethnic group as the largest group in America. By mid-century, it will continue doing that. It's kind of where things are headed, economically, culturally, religiously, and so I think it'd be great for students to take a class like that so they kind of have a feel for that. Z-Tag is an intercultural course, so there's a minimum, I believe, of like 25 hours of personal intercultural contact with a culture different from your own. The students will be farmed out to different Hispanic churches in the Twin Cities. And the goal is that will actually be their church for the semester. So they should have an understanding of the history of that particular church, how they came to be, what they care about, what's theologically and communally important to them. And they'll do that by going there and simply being a part of the congregation. If they go through the process, almost all the time, they will come away truly understanding a world different from theirs.
So Eve, if you could tell us a little bit about Eidem Homestead. Where does this farm come from?
The Eidem Homestead was actually first homesteaded in the late 1850s, we believe. The Eidem family bought it in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and they farmed it for 82 years, and it was in the family, and the city bought it directly from the family. We do portray turn of the century, so about 1900 time period, and because Brooklyn Park was a big farming community, we emphasized the potato farming, as well as the family also raised sheep and grew onions.
Okay, so it looks like we're in the farmhouse right now in the kitchen. You want to tell us a little bit about the farmhouse itself, or what kind of things you tend to show people when they come through?
For our tours, we kind of split up. The kitchen is always very fascinating, and then we do the rest of the house. A lot of the interesting things that kids find are showing the ice box, because they didn't have a refrigerator, the wood stove, doing a bathtub. We have an infant bathtub, and explaining how they took baths, and it was only once a week. Kids love seeing adults, especially their dads, come and try and take a bath in the bathtub. We have butter churning that we do sometimes, and just a lot of different things that we do in the kitchen here. So.
Okay, cool. We'll when we come back from our next segment, we'll talk to Eve a little bit more about another piece of the farm, and a little bit more about maybe public history and how that's different from academic history. But let's meet another one of our Bethel alumni who's gone off into a very different kind of career.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
Hi, I'm Tim Krueger. I am the Mutuality editor and publications coordinator at CBE International, and I was a history major. I grew up in the Philippines. My parents are missionaries with Wycliffe Bible Translators, so I grew up in kind of a little tropical paradise with a bunch of, in kind of a missionary community. So I was trained to be a little linguist from day one, which was great. When I actually lived in the States for a few years before I started Bethel, so I think a lot of the typical missionary kid things weren't applicable to me. My challenges were more from my personality than anything else, but I think that it did give me a different perspective than a lot of people, just because everything that I approached, I thought about it through what would a Filipino think, and how do these Americans who actually grew up here think. And so that's something that I do a lot anyway, probably because of my upbringing largely. But I think that's probably the main thing that was different about me that I noticed from other people, other students. I loved social studies my whole life, and I was kind of torn between geography and history. I had determined that I would just do what I liked, because then maybe I would be happy in my job one day. And Bethel had history, and there were people I knew who were going to Bethel, and it seemed like a good place, so I said, well, I guess I'll do history. I don't know if I had one defining moment. I TA'd for Dr. Rivera, which was really significant for me, just sitting in his office absorbing his wisdom for hours on end. I think I learned and was challenged and grew through that as much or more than in my classes. As far as the class side of it, I think the Modern Europe class was really significant for me, reading Ordinary Men and the Dynamite Club, because they really force you to, they pull you into these worlds and force you to you think about yourself in relation to people that you wouldn't naturally associate yourself with. And to me, that's a big part of what history is learning empathy and perspective. And when you are drawn into another world, you develop that ability. And I think the third thing I would say is kind of when I felt, I don't know when it was, but at some point I felt like I knew, the answer to the question, why do you study history? And I realized it's because I want to be wise. And what do you do when you want wise counsel? You go talk to an old person who's been through a lot and seen a lot and developed that perspective and empathy. And by studying history, it's like you get to meet hundreds and hundreds of people. Anyone who is really interested in their major, I think I would recommend that. I just think that there's, not only do you get some, if you're interested in going on and doing grad work and teaching one day, I would definitely recommend it. I didn't do that, but I think being able to see it from the other side is valuable, and just having that personal relationship beyond the classroom is really significant, because in my opinion, the profs at Bethel are the most educated people I will probably ever deal with on a regular basis. So I was really happy to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. CBE is an organization dedicated to advocating for women in leadership positions in the church. I got here, my wife interned here before we were married when we were students at Bethel. So that's how I knew about it. After I graduated, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I kind of wanted to keep going to school, but there wasn't something, like one thing that I was so passionate about that I wanted to spend years and years studying just that. So I did AmeriCorps for a year in between, and then they were actually looking for someone to do admin here, and I was like, I can do that in the meantime. And then they recognized that I was good at editing and writing, so my job has sort of morphed into what it is now. And what I do now is I edit our magazine, which looks at the practical outcomes of the theological issues we deal with. And I oversee all of our publications. The main other one is an academic journal, so I handle the logistics and budgeting and things like that for everything. I think that good history writing is typically like good writing generally. And I would say, I guess the advice, I would maybe give 4 pieces of advice, I think. First of all, write with intention. And by that I mean everything that you write should be focused on what you're doing. You should know your audience. You wouldn't submit the same resume to McDonald's as you would to the UN. And the same goes for writing. You need to know what you're trying to do. You need to know who you're trying to tell it to. And then everything that you do should be focused around that. And you should be cutting out anything that doesn't build your points. The second thing I would say is have people read your writing. I pretty much never did that when I was a student, because I've always been very self-conscious about my writing. I was comfortable with teachers reading it, but not other students. But now I'm forced to do that, and it really does make it better, because you're forced to see the things that make sense to you but don't make sense to someone else. It can be very frustrating, but it always makes a better result. The third thing I would say is less is more. I never liked word count requirements in school because they sometimes made me write more than I actually needed to write to make my point. I deal with word counts now, but it's always less. And you can almost always make your work shorter. It's easy to spew ideas out on a page. What's hard is to craft it into something clear and succinct. And the fourth thing that I would say is what I was told when I started editing a magazine was good writing doesn't tell you, it shows you. And I think that's especially important for history, because I think a lot of people don't like it because they have read a lot of books that just told them stuff and told them facts. But the books that I remember and the books that made an impact for me were the books that drew me into the world of the people that I was studying and made me think, what would I do if I were in their position, if I were dealing with this and this and this? What are their motives? And it really humanizes the issue, and it humanizes the other people that you deal with in the world. And I think that's really important for history.
I think that you should take history in the human environment because you get exposure to a discipline of history that really, of the courses that we offer, is the newest discipline. So environmental history has, although the environment has clearly been around forever, the actual study of the environment and the impact that it has on human history is a field that's relatively new. I think students really benefit from taking the particular tools that they learn from the environmental history course as they then can go out and apply them to any of the other subjects that they're going to study. And it becomes an enriching way to sort of look at things from a different perspective, to kind of shift. We're always looking at history as, the human beings that are interacting are in the front, and nature kind of serves as a backdrop. And what the environmental history allows you to do is to say, well, what happens if nature were telling the story? So how do we look at the same stories, but from a completely different perspective that gives us a much better, bigger picture? How you live is determined by where you live. And so at the very beginning of the class, students, we talk about this idea. How have you been formed and shaped by the particular environment that you've lived in? For most of us, that's a struggle. We think it has no impact. And so the initial reaction is to say it doesn't affect anything. But then as we sort of pick it apart, we learn more about it. We realize how much we've been shaped by that environment. And then what the study of environmental history does is it allows us to look at each society and to say, why do these people either achieve the things that they did? When there's a downfall, when societies collapse, what were the factors that contributed to the collapse, and how did the environment shape that? I think that idea of how you live how you live is determined by where you live is a central idea that goes throughout all of it, and that students walk away with and say that they'll kind of forever keep thinking about.
So I imagine that one of the favorite things for the kids who come to Eidem is interacting with the animals a little bit. Can you talk a little about the educational mission of what you're trying to do here?
Mm-hmm. We do, for our tours, we always talk about the different functions of the farm, and especially the roles on the farm with the people. So really emphasizing that every person and every animal had a purpose or responsibility. The farm animals weren't just for pets, they were there for, cows were there for getting milk, the chickens were for eggs, sheep were there for getting the wool to make blankets and sweaters and stuff like that. And then same with in the house, you have moms who did kitchen work, and kids would always be picking up sticks. They'd have to be emptying chamber pots and pumping water for the garden and bringing into the house. So we really emphasize kind of how everything worked together, and there was community with that.
So how do kids, especially when they visit, how do they respond to this? What?
They really enjoy it. It's very surprising what activities that they really enjoy. Pumping water is always really fun, and doing laundry. We have an old washer bringer, and they love doing the laundry. It's very popular. Animals are always popular. They love feeding them and interacting with them.
Okay. We have one more segment of our conversation for this week about writing and history, and then we'll come back to you to talk a little bit about what you can do if you're interested in doing something like work at Eidem Homestead or a similar kind of public history opportunity. So Jacob and Fletcher, I'm going to start with a question I didn't give you in advance, so you're a little bit on the spot here. But as you think over the many, many forms of writing you've done in history classes at Bethel, you've probably done everything from 200-word reading response, or maybe an essay on a midterm exam, all the way to a 25-plus page senior sem capstone paper. As you think about those, which, I guess, mini-genre are you most comfortable with? Which was most challenging for you, and why?
I think I really enjoyed writing the senior seminar paper because it was time to reflect on the things I'd researched and really test the connections that I was developing between those ideas. Whereas a short essay for a midterm or other assignment, by contrast, there's less time, and there's less time to gather information and write. So you're kind of taking a shot in the dark in some ways with your conclusion. So that's what's difficult about those shorter assignments, I think.
Yeah, you're both rushed and just working a very small
exactly
space.
Yeah.
Same for you, I imagine.
Yeah, that suggests. For me, the easiest assignments are at both ends of the spectrum. The really short things are quite easy because, due to their nature, you can't reflect a lot on them. You just have to put something out, and that's okay. And the long ones, likewise, you have time to reflect. You have time to think and to parse your thoughts.
So those pesky 5-pagers.
Yeah, it's the 5 to 7 page essay.
I'm writing one right now. So.
Because you have to ask an interesting question, you have to answer it, and do so in a relatively condensed format, and that's not always possible or particularly interesting to do.
So I would interject that my least favorite part of that is writer, but maliciously, my favorite part of that as a professor is that forces editing, which I think is a piece of the writing process that's often neglected. You don't just sit down in one shots. I mean, maybe if with a really short assignment you can do it in one shot, but for most forms of writing, it's either it's a growing thing or it's something you put down and then you revise many times. So that'd be my piece of advice. I will now step back and ask you, as not just students, but as TAs who have probably graded your fair share of college writing work. Let me start with, for the first and second year students in this class, what are some writing habits they might need to unlearn? What are some things they might have taken with them out of high school or things that haven't really been challenged in their first year of college, that if they're going to be successful writers in history courses, they're going to need to make adjustments to?
Well, I think sometimes those adjustments need to be made with just making sure we write complete sentences.
Good start.
We got to have complete sentences. Comma splices are just
rampant.
Yeah, the bane of a college student. And committing those simple errors that we think we've mastered, but really are making sloppy mistakes that are very distracting, perhaps. So sometimes it takes going to the writing center or having someone read your essay, or just looking at the comments from a professor and asking, "Oh, I didn't write a complete sentence. What am I missing here? What am I not understanding?" So we need to be open to critique and realize that even the basic things can be improved.
Yeah, I think simple copy editing can do a lot to improve an essay. I know as a grader, and I don't know how maybe good this technically is, but when I first look at a piece, I start reading through it, and if I start to see just really noticeable errors, my opinion of the piece instantly suffers. And it's hard to come back from that, honestly. It's just, there's a basic level of competency which really should just be the baseline. And I think reading through what you've written after you've done it, using spell check, but obviously that doesn't catch synonyms or homonyms. So I think proofreading is a major component. And I think another thing, high school writing tends to be taught in a pretty formulaic way. Here's your question, think about how to answer it, paragraph form.
Paragraph
essay.
Yeah,
the five paragraph essay, yeah.
Classic.
And I guess paradoxically, I want to interrogate that, but also support that, because I think the first thing students really should do when they're sitting down to write an assignment is think about, okay, what is the assignment asking? How do I want to answer that? And how can I structure my writing so that I can answer that? So at the same time, it is relying on that kind of structure, but I think it's moving beyond that to focus more on the ideas, less on the physical organization of the essay, and more about, okay, what is the central thing I want to argue, to answer, to discuss or explore in this essay, and then maybe what's the secondary issue to that needs to be addressed, and then what are the particular pieces of evidence or paragraphs discussing particular ideas that support that central purpose. How can I lay that out? So I think even before writing, there's a sense in which you have to step back and think about the assignment in a more intentional way.
Yeah, and maybe a piece I'd overlay with that is you need to think about your audience in any form of writing, and the kind of peculiarity of writing in courses is your audience is an audience of one, and maybe that one, but the one who's going to be grading it. And I mean, both things you said, I think, play into that. I mean, for better or for worse, professors and TAs tend to be the kind of people who will be bothered by those simple grammatical and mechanical mistakes, and we are not perfect people. And it does shape our opinion. It does cultivate the sense of this was written carelessly, right? This was done too quickly, they didn't care enough about it, and it does make it harder to grade. And it's an easy fix, too, right? Invest in a good usage guide, have someone read it, go to the writing center. But at the same time,
read it out loud to yourself.
Yeah, read it out loud is fantastic advice. At the same time, on the other end, we also have the sense that there's a spirit underlying the assignment. There are objectives, and it's not just the mechanical completion. What we really want you to do is learn through doing this. And so if you're the kind of student who would do what Fletcher just said, I mean, you'll learn more about it. You'll make us very happy. And so you've satisfied a couple of ends. Any last pieces of parting advice for students as you have a chance, especially to address first-year students who might be struggling with early writing?
Yeah, I could say for myself, I've never really liked writing, but I do it quite often. So I've realized that in order to have my best thoughts about anything, I need to write, because writing is not just the end of your processing of an idea, it is also a part of that process of learning. So you might start writing and not really know exactly where the argument is going at first, and that might be part of the process of getting ready to make your point. I was just doing that last evening, writing a midterm essay, and I had to just start writing to help myself think through the question. So writing is really part of the learning process, and it's not something that we should just sit down to do once we think we've reached the conclusion.
Right. Fletcher, your last word?
Yeah, I guess I have kind of two pieces of advice. The first would be to reiterate some of what I said earlier. Writing is so much about ideas. The form of writing itself is important. Having correct grammar, all of those kinds of things, incredibly important. But when it comes down to it, writing is a way to convey ideas. And I think it's incredibly important to think about what you want to say. And in the history curriculum, one of the things I loved about it is there's so much opportunity to choose your own topics, to think about particular issues that you might be interested in. Take that opportunity, but think about the question you want to answer. Always have the question in mind, because writing assignments, I think, tend to be, it's easy to slip into sort of the narrative. I've researched this event and here's what happened. That's not interesting. Think about a question, think about a new way of interpreting it, and focus on that for your writing. And then the second thing I would have as advice is something you've actually been doing in class already with John Fia's book, but read about history. No, don't just read historical works. Read about the process of history. What is history? I mean, there are a number of works I can think of. Mark Bloch's The Historian's Craft has been a major influence for me. E.H. Carr's What is History is another fantastic one. They're both quick reads, and for me at least, they've really enhanced my understanding of the nature of history and of historical writing.
Okay, Fletcher Warren, Jacob Manning, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, before we say goodbye to Eidem Homestead and to Eve Burlingham, I just want to ask Eve, if students are interested in working here, do you have an internship program?
We do. It's pretty new. We just started this last year. So there's a lot of opportunities for here as an intern. We have several projects that we've started and we're working towards. Some of them are inventorying, costume collections, doing interpretive signage and scripts for our staff and volunteers. So if you're interested, you can find applications and more information on our website, which is www.brooklynpark.org/Eidem Homestead. And if you go under the volunteers page, you can find the application and more information on there.
And we can put a link on the blog as well. Do you have any advice for students who are thinking about internships? The ways to present themselves?
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to say what you're interested in and go after it. Enthusiasm is always a good thing if you're willing to try different things and not just stay in one particular area, even if you have an interest. Especially, I know in public history there's a lot of different aspects to it that you might not really be aware of, and so kind of being willing to be flexible with that is always a good thing.
It's really a great opportunity because it's so diverse. I mean, I think you can kind of get roped into the idea, well, you're only going to be designing exhibits or something, but actually one of the values of internships is you get to try a lot of different things, plus you get to make connections with people. And it's good, I think, for career discernment, too, to decide, is this really something you want to work at, and to think about what the next steps would be. So Eve, thanks so much for taking us around Eidem Homestead. Please do try to find an excuse to come up and visit here, and we'll see you back next week on Past and Presents.
Baby.